The Hearns victory proved to anybody who had even the slightest of doubt about the steely interior of Ray Charles Leonard that yes, he is a serial killer. $1 million smile and a pretty boy veneer lurked a boxer with the heart of a serial killer. People who think Ray is nice, they don't know how nice he is, said Dundee. And people who think he's a tough fighter don't know how tough a fighter he is. He's a nicer guy and a tougher fighter than people realize. Emmanuel Stewart enthusiastically concurred with this assessment. One of Ray's greatest attributes is that he's a very strong finisher. He could always close the show, said Stewart. Even in the first Duran fight, he was the guy coming on over the last few rounds. When people look at the babyface and small bone structure, they don't realize how strong and physical he is. Ray can be a total animal in the ring. Beyond his respect for Leonard's ability, Stewart had another concern in the days leading up to the showdown. I was afraid Tommy was overtraining, recalls Stewart. Here we go, Emmanuel. I tried to rein him in, but for the first time since he was 10 years old, he wasn't listening to me. He had this crowd of people around him, and they were telling him, Ray and Ollie run their camp, Angelo just comes in at the end, and they tell him what to do. So he was running in the morning, running again at night when I told him he shouldn't be doing so much. He said, I'm the one doing the fighting. A few days before the fight, there was a big crowd at Tommy's workout. We were supposed to be through with the sparring, but Shelley Saltman, who was doing PR for us that night, grabbed the microphone and announced that Tommy was going to box. I said, what? I thought I hadn't heard right, but Tommy had told Shelley to announce it. Yes, I'm going to box. He went 7 rounds with Caveman Lee and Dewan Johnson, 2 future Kronk title challengers, that same day. Another potential distraction, at daybreak one morning, an individual described as a hanger-on in the Hearns camp, who described himself as a bodyguard, was cleaning a pistol near the outdoor swimming pool, when suddenly the weapon accidentally discharged. Although nobody was injured, Caesar's security officials quietly moved to disarm the Hearns posse, at least until the fight was over. The showdown would affirm boxing's first undisputed welterweight champion since Jose Napoles, but although Leonard held the WBC title and Hearns the WBA, neither championship was even mentioned in the contract. Both organizations belatedly agreed to sanction the bout, but when their representatives arrived in Vegas, instead of getting the red carpet treatment, the tin pot boxing dictators from Mexico and Venezuela discovered that they were expected to stand in the same credential line as everybody else. When they complained about waiting to have their photos taken, it was presumably to say, we don't need no stinking badges. Why do they bother taking these guys' pictures, wondered Burke Sugar. They could get them right off the post office wall. In September 1981, Leonard actually owned 2 world title belts. The previous June, he and Hearns had laid the groundwork for the showdown by sharing a bill at the Astrodome in Houston, where Hearns defended his WBA welterweight championship, stopping Pablo Baez in 4, while Leonard TKO'd Ayub Kaluli in 9 to win the WBA junior middleweight title. The rationale for the joint appearance had been simple. Although the clamour for a Leonard-Hearns bout had commenced shortly after Duran said no mass in New Orleans, Mike Traynor said at the time that while boxing people don't know all about him, the American public doesn't even know who Tommy is. It was hoped that sharing the spotlight with Ray at the Astrodome would help correct that deficiency. The most memorable pre-fight moment in Houston came after Bob Arum's publicist Irving Rudd trotted out what was supposed to be an authentic African witch doctor, ostensibly to boost the chances of the Ugandan-born Kaluli by casting a spell on Leonard. It was a cheap publicity stunt that appealed to the most base stereotypes that at least one African American on hand was prepared to denounce it as such. Outside the hotel, Rock Newman, later the manager and promoter of Riddick Bowe, then a Washington area sports radio personality, staged an impromptu press conference to decry the witch doctor gimmick and all that it implied. Newman was wearing white trousers and a white dye shiki, And as he stood there berating the witch doctor and railing against the racial overtones implicit in the gag, he was suddenly set upon by a flock of angry crows, who without warning swooped in from the sky and attacked Rock with such ferocity that he was forced to flee in terror. Score one for the witch doctor. Native Texans later explained that everyone in Houston knew better than to wear white in the summer because the color was known to antagonize the local crows. Leonard, in any case, was allowed to hang on to both belts through the summer. Granted dispensation by the sanctioning bodies, he had until 10 days after the Hearns fight to decide which one he would keep. Sharing the spotlight with Hearns in Houston had brought about Leonard's first day-to-day interaction with the hitman. Leonard's impression? They ought to lobotomize Hearns just to see if there's a brain in there, he said unkindly. The remark was widely circulated and would be frequently revived in the run-up to their September fight, like Muhammad Ali's equally mean-spirited description of Joe Frazier as ignorant and a gorilla 10 years earlier. It would serve as bulletin board material for the opposing camp. Although the outcome of the Nomas fight seemed to have proved Dundee and Traynor right and Jacobs wrong, the breach was now irreparable. Having completely severed his ties with the Leonard camp, Jake volunteered his services to the enemy. Ray's old amateur coach volunteered his services to the enemy. In 1981, Ray's old amateur coach materialized in Las Vegas as a member of Hearns' entourage. Although Stewart welcomed his input, it is questionable how much advanced intelligence Jacobs actually contributed. He walked around Caesars in a Kronk boxing team jacket and held court for the press. But on fight night, Jacobs was not in Hearns' corner. Stewart said he had known Jacobs for several years. They had been friends since the 73 Gloves, that's the AAU tournament. He was part of our camp for the Leonard fight, but he did not give us advice how Tommy should fight Leonard. He didn't have to. I knew Ray as well as anyone, said Stewart. I've seen him for most of his amateur career. I coached Ray on several international amateur teams, and he came to the Kronk to prepare for the 1976 Eastern Regionals before the Olympics. There wasn't anything Jacobs could have told me about Ray that I did not know already. Even though he was technically a member of the Hearns entourage in Vegas, Leonard's old mentor clearly had mixed feelings. 2 days before the showdown, he told a reporter, "If they called this fight off, I'd be the happiest man in the world." The Nevada State Athletic Commission had assigned the trio of Dwayne Ford, Chuck Minka, and Lou Tabat to be the judges. 63-year-old Davy Pearl, a fundraiser for University of Nevada at Las Vegas, was named the referee. At the pre-fight rules meeting, Dundee asked Pearl to be vigilant in monitoring certain tactics that Hearns had picked up watching films of the hitman's earlier fights. "Watch how many punches Hearns misses and then hits the guy with his backhand," said Leonard's trainer. "Or how many times he'll miss with a jab, then hold the guy with his left hand behind the head and throw a right. I warned the commission about these things at the rules meeting. They'll be watching out for it," said Dundee. "But so will my guy. When Hearns does that, he's off balance and Ray will catch him with left hands." A classic boxer-puncher matchup. Both participants appeared to subscribe to that view. "My right hand could make this the easiest fight I've ever had," said Hearns. "It's possible this fight can end very quickly, no more than 3 rounds. "Hearns makes mistakes," countered Leonard. "He tries to knock out everybody with one punch. I use my mind. Maybe Tommy would too, if he had one." "Emmanuel Stewart is no dummy," said another interested observer, Marvin Hagler. "I expect Hearns will try to take Leonard out early, and I'm sure he'll be the aggressor. Of course, when the bell rings, you never know what may happen. Hearns might not fight that fight the way he's supposed to win, but I think he will." Hagler would not be an eyewitness to the showdown. The middleweight champion was again sequestered at his training camp in Provincetown, preparing to make his third title defense against Mustafa Hamsho in the Chicago suburb of Rosemont a few weeks later. Neither Hearns nor Leonard had ever fought as a 160-pounder, but even in 1981 it was apparent that both loomed as potential Hagler opponents. Marvin was doing double duty the week of the Leonard-Hearns showdown, covering the fight as a guest columnist for the Boston Herald-American before leaving for Vegas. I'd sat down with Marvin in Provincetown for his analysis. And in the days leading up to the fight, we spoke each day by telephone. The Duran fight was his toughest test so far, but his fight against Hearns will be even tougher, Hagler had predicted. To neutralize Hearns' reach advantage, Leonard is either going to have to stay inside or boxing from the outside. My guess is that Ray will stay outside and box and make Tommy come to him. Leonard is a very good counterpuncher. The way Hearns carries his left hand so low looks dangerous, but it really isn't, added Marvin. Not if he keeps the proper distance. There is a safe distance and an unsafe distance, and Hearns is awfully quick. If Leonard tries to come inside that left, well, there's a saying in boxing that if he's close enough to hit you, he's close enough for you to hit him. That's especially true with those long arms that Tommy has. It had not gone unnoticed that Hearns had a proclivity for running out of gas in longer fights. In addition to the issue of Hearns' punching power versus Leonard's boxing abilities, the matter of the hitman's stamina was also called into question. Only 2 of Hearns' fights had ever gone the distance, and his longest fight ever was when he went 12 in beating Randy Shields, noted Hagler. But Randy Shields is the sort of fighter who can make a firing squad look bad. But when Hearns was asked about the possibility of the fight lasting into the later rounds, he seemed confident. Tired, I'm still able to break ribs and break jaws. At a breakfast with the press a few days later, before the fight, Hearns was asked about the mind games Leonard seemed to be playing. If he's trying to psych me out, said Hearns, he's not doing a very good job. The widespread assumption was that the judges would bend over backwards for Leonard and that Hearns almost had to score a knockout to win. One of the wire services, in fact, polled out-of-town boxing writers on the matter, and of 70 prognosticators queried, only 1 picked Hearns by decision. Even Emmanuel Stewart seemed to share the view that the judges would be disposed towards Leonard. If the fight goes 15 and it goes to a decision, it will be, interesting, said Stewart. The bettors, the gamblers, apparently subscribed to the opinion, wagering that the fight would end by knockout was an odds-on 2-5 proposition. Leonard had been posted as a narrow favourite when the fight first went up on the board, and remained so until 2 nights before the fight, when so much Motown money came rolling in that Hearns would be a 7-5 favourite. Having made their cases for the conventional wisdom, Hagler and both trainers allowed themselves more wiggle room by conceding that the fight might not unfold the way everyone expected. Leonard knows he can't run all night, said Hagler. He'll have to give them a show, but I figure he'll try not to mix it up early, hoping that Hearns will get tired and sloppy in the later going. But you never know, mused Marvin. Leonard might try to punch with Hearns. He showed a tendency to do that in some of his more recent fights, especially in that last one against Kaluli. If he does that, I think it will be a mistake. People forget Tommy wasn't always a puncher, Stewart said. In his whole amateur career, he hardly knocked anyone out. He was a boxer, and he's a boxer now. My guy's going to back him up, said Dundee, although a few expected that to happen. One of them will be a loser, and the other one is doomed, said Hagler, because the winner gets me. Stewart, Walter Smith, and Prentice Bird comprised the brain trust in the Hearns camp. Bird, Stewart's aide by the camp, was a former minor leaguer in the Chicago White Sox system. Smith, a retired automotive worker. The colourful 4th figure in the front corner was Don Thibodeau, a Detroit artist and sculptor with long red hair and an even longer beard, which reached nearly to his navel. Thibodeau was successful in his day job. He once sold a bust of Muhammad Ali for 40 grand, but found himself inexorably drawn to the sweet science and Stewart's steamy inner city gym. Mickey Goodwin, the Kronk middleweight, who had been the main event performer on the early cards on which Hearns boxed, recalled a night when Thibodeau was working his corner. At the second's out command, Thibodeau had bent over and shoved Goodwin's gumshoe back in, and a large mouthful of beard also along with it. You ever tried to get hair out of your mouth with boxing gloves on? Asked Goodwin. As the 16th of September dawned, Hagler said, I'm sure both of them woke up this morning just wishing this fight was over. The day before the fight, I wanted to check Tommy's weight, but he shooed me away and said I'm fine, recalled Stewart. Then when we got to the scales the next day, Tommy was 145. I thought I could see Ray Leonard's jaw drop. Everyone seemed shocked. I was worried right then and there, and with good reason. It turned out, said Stewart, half a tank of gas might get you where you're going, but I don't care what kind of car you've got. If you don't have enough in the tank for a long trip, you're not going to go all the way. A lengthy undercard that began under the hot afternoon sun played out as darkness fell across the desert. Tony Ayala Jr., a junior middleweight prospect promoted by the Duvers, went 10-0 with a first-round knockout of Jose Rendiz. Heavyweight Tony Tucker, then trained by Stewart, stopped Harvey Steichen in 3. Marvis Frazier scored a 4th-round TKO over Guy Cassell. In the co-feature, another future world champion, lightweight Edwin Rosario, outpointed James Martinez. The early prelims had been fought before a smattering of witnesses, but as twilight turned to evening, an audience that would eventually reach 23,306 people began to file into the makeshift stadium. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, George Carlin, Bill Cosby, Jack Nicholson, Sharon Bono, Jesse Jackson, Carl Malden, Bo Derek, and John McEnroe were amongst the audience. Fans gawked as present and former champions from Larry Holmes to Joe Frazier to Jake LaMotta took their places in the stands. Biggest ovation was reserved for a late arrival, Muhammad Ali, who just a few months later would engage in his final bout in the Bahamas. The great man, who Leonard had appropriated his nickname from, Sugar Ray Robinson, was also ushered to a ringside seat. By nightfall, the temperature had reached a high of 96 degrees that autumn afternoon. The heat subsided, but under the glare of the lights from the canopy above, it was still almost 100 in the ring. Both participants entered the ring in shimmering white satin robes. Leonard had a coin toss to determine the order of procession, so Hearns was the first to arrive. The words "winner takes all" was emblazoned across the back of his robe. Leonard said simply "deliverance." Before the fight started, Tony Ayala, who had won on the undercard, was running up to the ring and calling out Leonard, recalled Michael Katz. It occurred to me that you have never heard anyone calling out Hearns. Nobody wanted to fight a 6' 1" welterweight with the power to destroy Pepino Cuevas and later Roberto Duran inside 2 rounds. I have to interject there. That's fair enough, but he could be calling out Leonard because the paydays are way more lucrative. When Leonard was introduced, Hearns banged his gloves together in mock applause, and then a menacing scowl on his face followed. The scowl, of course, was aimed directly at Ray. This bit of gamesmanship was countered by Dundee, who complained to Pearl about what he considered an excessive amount of Vaseline smeared across the hitman's face. Just before the start, I was standing up in my seat and I turned to Joe Flaherty and said, "Let's have a fight," remembered Katz. I had no idea who was going to win. Dundee and Morton worked Leonard's corner when they were augmented by Ollie Dunlap and, at least initially, Ray's brother Roger. Moments after the opening bell, Bob Arum materialized beside the ring apron, shouting, "Stop the fight." Arum wasn't even the promoter of the showdown, but he had arranged the pay-per-view distribution. He had just been informed that due to a glitch in the cable system, thousands of homes in California were not receiving the signal for free. He somehow had it in his mind that Pearl should stop Hearns and Leonard from boxing until the technical difficulties could be overcome, but the referee ignored him. What unfolded that night turned out to be a symphony in 5 distinct movements. The first, comprising the opening 5 rounds, was a protracted overture in which both combatants performed brilliant, but pretty much as advertised. While Leonard dazzled with his hand speed, he seemed wary of Tommy's punching power, that he wasn't about to mix it up, and Tommy, for his part, used his reach advantage to poke away at Leonard with jabs when he came near enough. As the round drew to a close, Roger Leonard excitedly shouted something to his brother. Distracted, Ray looked away as Hearns punched him just after the bell. The referee jumped between the 2 fighters, but as Leonard stumbled back to his corner, Janks Morton shouted down from the ring, "Kenny, get Roger out of the corner." Kenny Leonard, already wearing a white satin cornerman's jacket, was thus handed a promotion and replaced his brother in the corner for the balance of the fight. Leonard's corner told him to keep Hearns moving anti-clockwise. Most of Hearns' victims, fearing his long reach and superior jab, had allowed him to box in his comfort zone, which was going to his left, and in denying Hearns the jab had exposed himself to an even more fearsome weapon, his right hand. Leonard spent much of the early going darting around a ring as if he had an invisible jetpack mounted on his back. Backwards, forwards, sideways, he flitted from corner to corner, rope to rope, presenting a tantalizing target, only to whoosh out of range as Hearns closed. When Tommy landed, it was usually with a glancing blow, and when Leonard scored, he escaped before the hitman could exact retribution. Leonard bent forward from the waist, presenting an even smaller target, but if Hearns was frustrated by the awkward angles in which he was forced to attack, he didn't let on. Behind his jab, he continued to walk Leonard down, and the expression on his face was that of a man who knew sooner or later he was going to catch up with his quarry. Periodically, he seemed to smile disdainfully, the ring lights exaggerating the expression by illuminating the flash of his gum shield. In the third round, the two stopped and briefly went toe-to-toe. Neither man emerged with a clear advantage. Leonard got on his bicycle. By the end of the round, a telltale welt had begun to form under his left eye. Whether it was an exacerbated residue of Odell Hadley's elbow 3 weeks earlier, or the result of a Hearns punch, or some combination of the two, remains the subject of some debate years later. But Emanuel Stewart remains convinced that the puffy eye was the result of Hearns' attack. Sometimes a fighter will get cut in training and it will open up during the fight, but I never saw any evidence of swelling on Ray's face beforehand, said Stewart. Throughout the fight, Dundee applied his secret weapon, an end swell, to Leonard's swollen eye. Although it is now standard equipment for most corners today, in 1981 the contraption seemed like a space-age invention, essentially a miniature flat iron, like something you might find in a dollhouse, noted Pat Putnam. The device was stored in an ice bucket to be pressed against the boxer's face to reduce swelling. On several occasions, Pearl had to move in and separate the fighters after the bell, and at one point, Leonard, reprising a playground gesture from the Duran fight, wound up his right as if to throw a bolo, and instead threw a left. Hearns responded by sticking out his gum shield in derision. It wasn't surprising that Hearns was ahead, with the fight already 1/3 over. What was surprising was that he had gained that advantage by outboxing Leonard. Their mutual respect was such that neither man was willing to go on the attack, and the result was that in the early going, Hearns maintained control with his jab and superior wingspan. From a technical standpoint, it was enthralling to watch it unfold, but some of the spectators grew restive. There were pockets of booing during the first opening 5 rounds, said Katz. It was more like a chess match. For the first 5 rounds, the 6'1" Hearns was in command, stinging Leonard with his jab and keeping his shorter opponent at bay with his vaunted 78-inch reach. One scribe described this initial interlude. Unable to get inside where he wanted to operate, Leonard had to fight outside, and he paid in pain. The momentum abruptly shifted in the 6th, when Leonard spotted a moment of complacency and seized the advantage. Hearns dropped his right for a split second, and Leonard pounced on the opening to land a vicious left hook to the body that drove Tommy back into the ropes. Emanuel Stewart would later describe it to Putman as the punch from which Hearns never recovered. His killer instinct ignited. Leonard treated Hearns' midsection like a speed bag, tattooing him with barrages of punches to an unprotected body. When Hearns dropped his elbows to protect his ribcage, Leonard merely readjusted his sights and shifted his attack to the head. Despite the terrible pummeling, Hearns somehow stayed on his feet, and when the bell rang to end the round, Leonard seemed to smirk and asked him, "You all right?" The 7th was once again all Leonard, and Hearns absorbed such a beating that Stewart considered rescuing his man by throwing in the towel. Hearns fought the entire round going backwards. He survived it, but was looking the worse for wear. Leonard, as a coda to the round, finished it by landing 3 successive left hooks. Although Hearns didn't go down, he was legless and all but out on his feet for much of the 6th and 7th. All 3 judges scored the rounds for Leonard, but not one of them scored it at 10-8, as did many scribes at ringside. "I was ready to stop the fight," said Emanuel Stewart, "and if Ray had landed one more solid punch, I would have done. But Tommy was avoiding them, barely, And then, much to my surprise, Tommy went back to boxing and eventually took control again. By the 8th, the roles had reversed. Leonard had become the stalker, trying to walk Hearns down for the big punch that would end it all, and the hitman had mounted the bicycle, still dancing away, but now firing jabs to cover his retreat. It seemed as good a time as any for an intermission, and as if by mutual consent, both fighters took the 9th round off. Downshifting, said Dundee, was my idea. I was afraid Ray was going to pop a cork in there. Hearns needed no encouragement to take a breather, but was so wary from the battering he had taken in the middle rounds that it was midway through the 10th, when he was alerted by the restive booing and whistling of the crowd, that he began to assimilate the fact that he was no longer under attack. Leonard had been presenting awkward angles all night, but now there was a new twist to his posture. His head tilted at an odd angle, swiveled around to compensate for a rapidly decreasing field of vision. If he had faced Hearns head on, he couldn't see the right coming. But even as he reasserted himself over the 11th and 12th rounds, Hearns withheld the weapon that was supposed to be the ultimate deterrent. Although he was dominating Leonard once again, conventional wisdom had it that this fight would turn on Leonard's ability to absorb Hearns' big right hand. But Tommy never threw the haymaker. He kept moving off to the side, so I couldn't hit him with the full force of the punch, Hearns would later explain. I still haven't hit him with my best shot. Why didn't I try to land more right hands? Hearns questioned himself. Basically because I don't throw a punch if I know it's not going to land. As the 12th round ended, Tommy seemed firmly in control and had won over much of the crowd. They were chanting, "Tommy, Tommy," and Hearns acknowledged their newfound allegiance by waving his arms like a cheerleader as he returned to his corner. Across the ring, Dundee toweled off Leonard's face and attempted to communicate the urgency of the situation. "You're blowing it, son," he shouted. "You're blowing it." Dundee couldn't have known it, but his opposite number was even more worried. Stewart's fighter had assumed control of the fight, but he had paid a price. At the end of the 12th, Tommy came back waving to the crowd, but I was still worried, Stewart said. I knew Ray always finished strong. Even in the first fight with Duran, he came on in the last 3 rounds and beat the hell out of Duran. He was always physically strong.
He done the same to Benitez as well in the 15th round.
I was talking to Tommy and all of a sudden his head slumped down. He was out of gas. I knew right then it was over. More to the point, Hearns was now in uncharted waters. He had never before fought a 13th round. By now, Leonard's eye had ballooned so grotesquely that you half expected Dundee to produce a razor, a la Burgess Meredith in Rocky, and provide relief by slicing open the hematoma. At the point, the eye was so badly swollen that somewhere between half and 3/4 of my vision was impaired, Leonard would recall. He was starting to get through with some jabs and some rights. Because I couldn't see, that's why I wanted to end it quickly. I just pulled it up from my guts. Early in the 13th, Hearns stumbled as Leonard shoved him, and then unaccountably dropped his hands again. Spotting the opening, Leonard fired a right-hand lead to the head, followed by a left hook that wobbled Hearns in his tracks. Leonard, smelling blood in the water, abandoned all pretense of elegance. He landed an uppercut and then unleashed an uninterrupted fusillade of at least 24 rapid-fire punches that drove Hearns across the ring, through the ropes and onto the apron. Pearl did not rule it a knockdown, and as Hearns teetered precariously on the apron, one of the judges reached up and steadied his back to keep him from falling over the edge. Pearl said he had been pushed, wrote the Boxing Board of Scotland, Hugh McIlvenny. All of us had better hope we never encounter such pushing in a busque. Get up, the referee inexplicably ordered Hearns. Pearl would later explain that he had meant to say, can you get up? Hearns was helped to his feet, but appeared lost. If ever a situation demanded that a boxer in trouble tie up his opponent, this was it. But at that moment, Hearns looked like he had never heard the word clinch. He probably hadn't. Prior to the Leonard fight, Stewart had boasted that you never see a clinch in the Kronk gym, as if it had been a point of honor. The events of that evening resulted in a revision of that philosophy. Oh yes, it did. In his whole career, Tommy never had to clinch, said Stewart. Later on, once he learned how to do it, he became an expert at it. Think about the fights with James Kinchin and Juan Roldan. But in that Leonard fight, He never even thought about it because he didn't know how. Left to his own devices, Leonard resumed right where he had left off, battering Hearns with a series of punches that once again knocked Tommy through the ropes. Tommy was looking dazed and cross-eyed. Hearns was left draped, half sitting across the bottom strand. "Off the ropes," ordered Pearl. Hearns groaned woozily, shaking his head. Pearl belatedly began the count. Hearns extricated himself by the time he reached 4, but he barely survived the round. As the fighters returned to their corners, Dundee was on his feet, shouting at Pearl. It should have been 2 knockdowns. In the corner, Dundee warned Leonard that he might still be behind on points. "I really didn't think he was, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to give him some extra needle," the trainer said later. But as it turned out, his worst-case assessment was right on the mark. Hearns might have led on the scorecards, but he was utterly spent. Leonard came charging out of the corner like a sprinter from his blocks to greet Tommy with a left hook. In the first minute of the round, he sent Hearns reeling with a savage right to the head and followed up with 4 or 5 more punches that knocked Hearns all the way across the ring. Leonard chased Hearns into the neutral corner. Tommy was now trapped. Leonard landed 3 rapid-fire hooks to the head. Hearns was now utterly defenseless. Pearl stopped the fight at 1 minute 45 of the round, and Leonard was the undisputed welterweight champion of the world. Hearns briefly, though unconvincingly, protested the stoppage before stumbling into the arms of his cornerman. Smiling through his gum shield, Leonard raised both gloves into the air as the crowd roared its approval of what had been a thrilling performance by both men. "I knew where I was at all times," Hearns would recall. "I wasn't dizzy or anything. It just seemed like every time he hit me with a combination, I hadn't got myself back together yet before he hit me again. It was in my mind to try and hang on
And last the distance.
even after I was hurt," admitted Hearns. "I thought I was in control of myself, but the referee didn't. There's nothing I can do about it." All 3 ringside judges had Hearns in front at the time of the stoppage. Minka had it 125-121, Tabat 125-122, and Ford 124-122. The judges were slated for their scorecards. Hugh McIlvenny, who cited a lack of perception and common sense, afflicted the 3 judges. McIlvenny reserved a particular place of dishonour for the late Chuck Minka, who he described as good old Chuck, who should not be allowed out without a guide dog. "I'm not saying Ray should be treated like Muhammad Ali. I'm not saying he should get everything that's close," moaned an astonished Mike Trainer when the scoring was revealed. "But Jesus, give him a fair shake. If you look at those scorecards, it'll turn your stomach." The referee's scorecards were indeed a surprise to most ringsiders. "Not as far as I was concerned," wrote British scribe Frank Keating. "Each of them was as daffy as Don King's barber. But Hearns claimed afterwards, I thought I was ahead." Years later, having reviewed the fight numerous times, Dwayne Ford would admit, "I was off in that fight, but Chuck was way off." "But the fight actually changed the scoring system in Nevada," said Ford, who would later become the chairman of the Nevada State Athletic Commission. "We had just gone from the 5-point system to the 10-point must system, and the way the rules read in 1981, we weren't allowed to score a 10-8 round with no knockdown." In an early edition story written before the fight, Mike Katz had noted that Mike Trainer had expressed concern that the judges might be predisposed against Leonard. His theory was that there might be some residual resentment over the way he and Leonard had altered the dynamics of big fights by letting the boxers and not the promoters call the shots. Trainer was very correct, recalled Mike Katz. Chuck Minka was later rewarded by being made the executive director of the Nevada Commission. "I have no qualms about the referee's decision," recalled Emmanuel Stewart. "Some people said Tommy was ahead on the scorecards. He should have been given a chance to finish the fight, but the truth is, if he had made it out of that round, he couldn't even have made it back to the corner, much less lasted another round. His legs were gone. He was cooked. I saw Thomas Hearns hurt, and I had never seen that before," said Stewart. Stewart, obviously mesmerized by what had taken place like the rest of us. "I saw Ray outboxed, and I never saw that before. One of the lingering memories that shocked a lot of people was that Tommy would be the boxer and Ray the slugger. When they appeared together at a post-fight news conference, Leonard and Hearns sounded downright affectionate. Ray even apologized for some of the things he said about Tommy, like he didn't have any brains. There was room for only one of us, said Leonard. We both stood our ground. In my book, we both still are champions. He's a superior athlete. Hearns said he gave his best. I made a couple of mistakes, and you can't afford to make mistakes against a fighter of Ray's caliber. When Leonard ruefully noted that Hearns had landed some really solid shots, somebody asked him if he had ever been in trouble. I knew I was in trouble, replied Leonard, the moment I signed the contract for this fight. Leonard didn't look much like a man who would just want to fight. His face was a mess. Later that night, Putnam was with Leonard in his suite when the boxer's 7-year-old son entered the room and got the first look at his battered father. Little Ray bit his lower lip, blinking away the tears in his bright eyes, wrote Putnam. Daddy, why you keep on fighting? Why you don't take up another sport? Like what? Like basketball? The all-night gamblers were still out there in force the next morning when Hearns and Leonard made their separate ways through the casino to meet with the press. Hearns wore a gold Kronk warm-up suit, while Leonard was dressed in white trousers and shirt, a white yachting cap perched atop his head. Both wore sunglasses to mask the evidence of the carnage of the previous evening. As the two sat side by side, one scribe was moved to note that the pair of them looked like the aftermath of a bad night on Gilligan's Island. Leonard recalled later that his face looked like the hunchback of Notre Dame. There was little discussion of a rematch. Leonard said he had the option of defending either the undisputed welterweight title or his WBA 154-pound championship. He seemed to be leaning to the former and pointedly invited junior welterweight champion Aaron Pryor, whom he accused of talking too much, to move up and challenge him. Aaron Pryor says he wants to get in the ring with me, said Leonard. He wants to be able to retire, and he will, for health reasons. Although an obvious big fight loomed against Hagler, Leonard didn't sound eager to have it any time soon. I think I'll be a middleweight in a year or two, said Leonard. I think the longer I wait, the older Hagler will get. What about Hearns and Hagler then? Leonard didn't even wait for Hearns to answer. Tommy can have him, he smiled. When Angelo Dundee was congratulated for his inspirational work in the corner that night, he shrugged and said, thanks, but Ray did the fighting. Both Leonard and Hearns would go on to win bigger battles and earn even more money than they did that night in 1981. Years later, they would even fight once more. Yet that magical evening in the desert remains in the estimation of most boxing historians the greatest welterweight fight of all time. I've covered nearly 400 world title bouts since, but with all its fascinating nuances, Leonard and Hearns 1 remains the best fight I was ever privileged to watch.